The radio crackled with static, then silence. Captain Rook pressed his hand against the mud-caked wall, feeling the vibration of distant artillery through crumbling concrete. His Marines were dug into what remained of a water treatment facility on the eastern edge of the valley, and the walls were closing in. 47 hours into what should have been a 12-hour recon mission, they'd stumbled into something far worse than intelligence had predicted. The enemy had fortified positions on 3 ridgelines, interlocking fields of fire, and by the sound of it, armor rolling in from the north. Rook's platoon was trapped in a kill box, and everyone knew it. The youngest Marine, Corporal Davies, kept checking his ammunition count even though they'd all done the same thing 6 times in the last hour. Staff Sergeant Mendoza hadn't cracked a joke in 2 days. That alone told Rook everything he needed to know about their situation. The satellite uplink had died during the night. Their last communication with Battalion was a broken transmission promising air support at dawn, but dawn had come and gone 4 hours ago. Nothing but empty sky and the distant thump of rotors that never came closer. Rook knew the math. They had maybe 3 hours of ammunition left if they rationed carefully, and the enemy knew exactly where they were. Every time someone moved near a window, rifle fire chipped away more of the building's skeleton. They'd already pulled back from the 2nd floor. Soon there'd be nowhere left to retreat. Then something changed. The enemy guns went quiet. Not the careful quiet of repositioning, but the sudden silence of hesitation. Rook caught Mendoza's eye across the room, both of them thinking the same thing. That kind of quiet meant one of 2 things. Either the enemy was about to overrun their position, or something had spooked them badly enough to make them reconsider. Through the shattered window frame, Rook heard it before he saw it. A sound like tearing canvas, a deep mechanical growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The sky had been empty for 2 days, but now something was coming. Something low and angry. One of the Marines, a rifleman named Collins who'd barely spoken since they got pinned down, moved to the window and tilted his head. His expression shifted from exhaustion to confusion, then to something Rook hadn't seen in days: hope. Collins turned back to the room, his voice hoarse but steady. "That's a hog," he said, using the nickname everyone knew. The A-10 Thunderbolt, the close air support aircraft that looked like it had been built in a hangar from spare parts and pure spite. Rook felt something unclench in his chest. If there was a warthog inbound, they had a chance. The radio hissed to life. A voice came through, calm and precise, with a slight rasp that suggested too many missions and not enough sleep. "Viper 2-1, this is Reaper 3-7. I've got eyes on your position. Understand you've had a rough couple of days." The voice paused, and Rook could almost hear the smile behind it. "Let's fix that." Rook grabbed the handset, his fingers shaking slightly from adrenaline and relief. "Reaper 3-7, Viper 2-1. We are danger close on all sides. Enemy armor moving in from grid November Delta 742. We've got maybe an hour before they're on top of us." He released the transmit button and waited, listening to the growing sound of turbofan engines somewhere beyond the ridgeline. The voice came back immediately. "Copy all. I'm going to make a low pass, mark targets with smoke. Keep your heads down and stay off the northern wall. This is going to get loud." There was a brief pause, then the voice added, almost conversationally, "And Viper 2-1, you're going to be fine. I've done this before." Staff Sergeant Mendoza looked at Rook with raised eyebrows. "She sounds pretty confident for someone about to fly into a shooting gallery." Rook didn't respond. He was watching the sky, waiting for the first glimpse of the aircraft that might be the only thing standing between his Marines and a very bad ending. Confidence was one thing. Delivering on it was another. The A-10 came in so low that Rook could see the pilot's helmet through the canopy. The aircraft looked exactly like its reputation suggested: ugly, blunt, and utterly pragmatic. Twin engines mounted high on the fuselage, a massive cannon protruding from the nose like an afterthought that had become the main attraction. It was painted in tactical gray, scuffed and weathered from countless missions. As it passed overhead, Rook caught a glimpse of nose art near the cockpit, a stylized hawk with spread wings and the name Reaper stenciled beneath it. The aircraft banked hard right, exposing its belly to enemy fire with an almost reckless disregard for self-preservation. Mendoza whistled low. Either she's crazy or she's really good. Both, Rook muttered. The aircraft disappeared behind the eastern ridgeline, and for a moment there was nothing but the fatting sound of engines. Then the world exploded. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon opened up with a sound that wasn't quite gunfire and wasn't quite thunder, somewhere in between, a mechanical roar that seemed to shake the air itself. Each burst lasted only seconds, but Rook could feel the impact through the ground as 30mm rounds chewed through enemy positions on the northern ridge. The enemy's heavy machine gun, the one that had kept them pinned for hours, went silent mid-burst. The A-10 pulled up and away, climbing with surprising grace for such an ungainly-looking aircraft. The radio crackled again. Viper 2-1, Reaper 3-7, Northern Ridge is suppressed. I'm coming around for another pass on that armor. Recommend you prepare for exfil once I've cleared a path. Her voice was steady, clinical even, but Rook detected something underneath, focus so intense it burned. Corporal Davies moved to the window, his earlier fear replaced by fascination. She's going after the tanks. It wasn't really a question, more like disbelief trying to process what he was seeing. The A-10 had already banked into another turn, this time approaching from the west. Lower this time, impossibly low, skimming treetops and rooftops with precision that suggested either intimate familiarity with the terrain or a willingness to accept catastrophic risk. The tanks never had a chance. The pilot, Reaper 3-7, whoever she was, came in at an angle that put the sun behind her, making her nearly invisible until the last second. She fired in short, controlled bursts, each one walking up the valley floor toward the advancing armor. Rook watched through binoculars as the first tank took a direct hit, its reactive armor detonating in a flash of light. The A-10 didn't slow down. It adjusted, fired again, and the second tank's turret separated from its chassis in a lazy arc. Mendoza stood beside Rook now, both of them watching the impossible ballet of violence unfolding above them. The enemy was shooting back, tracers rising from hidden positions, surface-to-air missiles leaving contrails as they tried to track the A-10's movements. But the pilot was already somewhere else, jinking and weaving with movements that seemed to anticipate the enemy's actions before they made them. A missile streaked past her left wing, missing by meters. She didn't react, didn't flinch, just continued her run and put rounds through another enemy position before pulling up and away. Jesus, Davies breathed. She's not even trying to dodge, she's just hunting. Rook understood what he meant. There was something methodical about the way the pilot worked, something almost surgical. Each pass had a purpose. Each burst of cannon fire addressed a specific threat. She wasn't just providing cover. She was systematically dismantling the enemy's ability to fight. Within 10 minutes, the valley had transformed from a carefully constructed ambush into chaos. Enemy fighters were abandoning positions, vehicles were burning, and the coordinated assault had collapsed into confusion. The radio came alive again. Viper 2-1, Reaper 3-7, you've got a clear corridor to the south. Recommend you move now while they're still disorganized. I'll stay on station and cover your movement. A pause, then, almost as an afterthought. There's a Chinook inbound to your exfil point, ETA 15 minutes. Let's get you home. Rook didn't waste time. Viper 2-1 copies, moving now. He turned to his Marines, saw the mix of relief and residual fear on their faces. You heard her. We move fast, stay tight, and don't stop until we're on that bird. Mendoza, take point. Davies, you're on my 6. They moved through the facility in practiced silence, boots crunching on broken glass and spent brass. Every Marine checked corners, covered angles, but their eyes kept drifting upward, tracking the dark silhouette of the A-10 as it orbited overhead like a guardian angel with a 30mm cannon. The enemy fired sporadically, but there was no coordination to it anymore. Fear had replaced discipline. As they crossed the open ground toward the extraction point, Rook heard the cannon fire twice more, short bursts that silenced enemy guns before they could find their range. The pilot was anticipating threats before his Marines even knew they existed, reading the battlefield with an awareness that bordered on prescient. She was keeping them alive, and she made it look easy. The Chinook came in fast and low, its twin rotors beating the air into submission. Rook counted his Marines as they boarded, all present, all accounted for. Miracle didn't quite cover it. As the helicopter lifted off, he grabbed the crew chief's shoulder and shouted over the rotor noise, "That A-10 pilot, Reaper 37. Who is she?" The crew chief grinned. "Captain Voss. Call signs Reaper. She's something else, isn't she?" Voss. Rook committed the name to memory. He owed her his life and the lives of every Marine on this bird. Through the Chinook's open ramp, he watched the A-10 make one final pass over the valley before turning south. Even from this distance, he could see the battle damage, scorch marks along the fuselage, pieces of the tail missing. She'd been taking hits the entire time, and he hadn't even known. The aircraft climbed into the afternoon sun and disappeared, leaving only the memory of that terrible, beautiful cannon fire, and the knowledge that sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected places. Back at base 3 hours later, Rook sat in the debriefing room and tried to explain what had happened in words that didn't sound like exaggeration. The intelligence officer taking his report kept glancing at him with polite skepticism, the kind of look that said he'd heard combat stress make people see things before. Rook gave up trying to moderate his language. "She saved us. That's the bottom line. We were dead without her." "We'll include that in the report," the officer said, tapping his tablet. "I'm sure Captain Voss will appreciate the recognition." The tone suggested this was routine, just another close air support mission that went according to plan. Rook wanted to argue but didn't have the energy. Let them think what they wanted. He knew what he'd seen. He found out more about Captain Alara Voss over the next few days, piecing together her story through the base's informal network of rumors and second-hand accounts. She'd been flying A-10s for 8 years, longer than most pilots lasted in the airframe. The Warthog wasn't glamorous, wasn't fast, and didn't win air superiority battles. It was a ground-pounder's aircraft, built for one purpose: keeping infantry alive. That meant flying low, slow, and directly into the teeth of enemy fire. It meant accepting risk that fighter pilots considered insane. The A-10 community was small, close-knit, and quietly proud of their unglamorous mission. And within that community, Voss was something of a legend. But legends were complicated, and Voss's story had rough edges. She'd come up through the Air Force Academy, top of her class in academics, but always fighting an uphill battle for respect. Female fighter pilots were still relatively rare, and close air support was considered the bottom of the fighter pilot hierarchy. Some instructors had suggested she'd be better suited to transport or tanker aircraft. She'd ignored them, pushed harder, and earned her wings through sheer determination. Then she'd requested the A-10, which surprised everyone. Most pilots saw the Warthog as a career dead end, a slow, aging airframe that wouldn't advance their prospects. Voss had seen something different, a chance to do the work that mattered most. Her first deployment had been rough. She'd flown with an all-male squadron that didn't quite know what to make of her. There were jokes, the kind that lived in the gray area between camaraderie and cruelty. Her call sign, Reaper, hadn't been a compliment initially. It started as mockery. Someone said she looked like death warmed over after a particularly brutal mission, and the name stuck. But Voss had claimed it, owned it, and eventually transformed it into something else entirely. By her third deployment, no one was laughing anymore. She'd logged more danger-close missions than pilots twice her age, and her gun camera footage showed a precision that bordered on artistic. Rook learned that her nose art, the hawk with spread wings, wasn't standard military issue. She'd painted it herself during her second deployment after a mission that went wrong. A Marine unit had called for support, and she'd arrived 30 seconds too late. 3 Marines died before she could suppress the enemy position. Those 30 seconds haunted her. The hawk was her reminder: be faster, be better, be there when it matters. She never wanted to be late again. Stories circulated about her other missions. There was the time she'd stayed on station for 3 hours beyond her fuel reserve, coordinating her departure with an incoming replacement aircraft to ensure continuous coverage for a surrounded Army patrol. She'd landed with her tanks almost dry, and the crew chief said her hands were shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion when she finally climbed out of the cockpit. There was the mission where she'd taken so much anti-aircraft fire that maintenance grounded her bird for a week, but the convoy she'd been covering made it through without casualties. She'd visited every member of that convoy in person to make sure they'd gotten home safe. But there were other stories too, quieter ones that revealed the cost of her commitment. She didn't socialize much off base, didn't date, spent her downtime studying enemy tactics and terrain maps. Some people called it dedication. Others worried it was something darker, an inability to step away from the mission even when the mission was over. Her squadron commander had reportedly pulled her aside more than once, suggesting she take leave, maybe talk to someone. Voss had smiled, thanked him for his concern, and gone right back to the flight line. Staff Sergeant Mendoza found Rook in the Chow Hall 4 days after the rescue, carrying a printed photograph. "You need to see this," he said, sliding the photo across the table. It showed an A-10 on the ground, its nose cone painted with the hawk emblem. But what caught Rook's attention were the small symbols beneath the aircraft's canopy, mission marks. Each one represented a successful close air support mission. There were dozens of them, maybe more than 100, each one a story of someone who'd called for help and found it. "She's got more combat missions than anyone else in the squadron," Mendoza said. "More than anyone in the wing, actually, and look at this." He pointed to a specific section of the photograph, where someone had stenciled words in small letters along the fuselage. "Always there." It was her personal motto, apparently. Simple words that carried an enormous weight of promise. Rook stared at the photograph for a long time. He thought about the sound of her voice on the radio, calm and assured even as she flew into hell. He thought about the precision of her cannon fire, the way she'd move through the sky like she owned it. But most of all, he thought about that moment when the enemy guns had fallen silent, when hope had seemed impossible and then she'd arrived. Always there. It wasn't bragging. It was a commitment, carved in 30mm rounds and delivered at 400 knots. "I want to thank her," Rook said finally, "in person." Mendoza nodded. "She's briefing tomorrow morning at 0800. Squadron building, 3rd floor. He paused, then added, "Fair warning, Captain, she doesn't really do the hero thing. I asked around. People say she's intense, focused, doesn't waste time on ceremony." "I don't care," Rook said. "She saved my Marines. She deserves to hear that." The next morning, Rook stood outside the briefing room and waited. Other pilots filtered in, carrying coffee and flight bags, their flight suits worn and comfortable. They glanced at him with mild curiosity. A Marine officer in camas wasn't unusual on a joint base, but lingering outside their briefing room was. He ignored their looks and kept his attention on the door. She arrived exactly 3 minutes before the briefing, walking with the efficient stride of someone who measured time in seconds and considered lateness a personal failure. She was shorter than he'd expected, maybe 5'6", with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, and a face that suggested Eastern European ancestry, high cheekbones, strong jawline. Her flight suit looked like it had seen 1,000 missions, faded in places and patched in others. She wore her squadron patch on her left shoulder, a stylized warthog with fangs. The call sign, Reaper, was embroidered across her chest in simple block letters. She saw him and stopped, her expression neutral but questioning. "Help you with something, Captain." Her voice was the same one he'd heard over the radio, but without the mission focus, it carried a hint of weariness, the sound of someone who hadn't slept properly in days. Rook straightened. "Captain Voss, I'm Captain Rook, Viper 2-1. You pulled my platoon out 4 days ago." He extended his hand. "I wanted to thank you properly." She shook his hand, her grip firm and brief. "You're welcome. Glad you made it out." There was no false modesty in her voice, no attempt to downplay what she'd done. She stated it like a fact, then moved to step past him. Rook spoke quickly. "You were taking fire. I saw the battle damage on your bird when you pulled off station. You kept flying even after." "It's the job," Voss interrupted, not unkindly. "You'd have done the same in my position." She studied him for a moment, and he had the unsettling feeling of being assessed the way she might assess terrain or enemy positions. "Your Marines performed well under pressure. Good discipline, good movement during exfil, made my job easier. They're alive because you were there." Rook wasn't going to let her deflect. 47 hours we were pinned. No one else was coming, just you." Something shifted in her expression, a brief flicker of something that might have been emotion before it disappeared behind professional composure. "Weather was bad. Delayed the air package. I got clearance to launch solo once it improved enough." She paused. "I don't like making people wait." "Your motto," Rook said, "always there, that's not just words, is it?" Voss's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger but with what looked like surprise that he'd done his homework. "No," she said quietly, "it's not just words." She glanced at her watch, then back at him. "I have a brief, but Captain Rook, your platoon did good work, be proud of them." She nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed respect and dismissal simultaneously, and walked into the briefing room. Rook stood there for a moment, processing the encounter. It hadn't gone the way he'd imagined. There had been no emotional reunion, no cinematic moment of mutual appreciation. But somehow it felt right. Voss wasn't interested in glory or recognition. She was interested in the next mission, the next group of people who needed her to be there. Anything else was a distraction. Over the following weeks, Rook heard more stories about Reaper 37. She flew almost every day, sometimes multiple sorties when the operational tempo demanded it. Other pilots talked about her with a mixture of respect and concern. "She's going to burn out," one of them said in the O Club, nursing a beer. "Nobody can maintain that pace forever." But Voss kept flying, kept showing up, and kept bringing people home. Then came the mission that changed everything. Rook heard about it third hand, piecing together details from people who'd been there or knew someone who had. An Army Special Forces team had been compromised deep in enemy territory, their position overrun before they could extract. The situation was what military planners called catastrophic. Too far from friendly forces for ground rescue, too hot for helicopter insertion, and enemy air defenses too strong for standard air support. Command was preparing to write them off, to accept the loss and move on. Voss had been in the operations center when the call came in. She'd listened to the Special Forces team's last transmission, heard the resignation in their voices as they prepared to make a final stand. And she'd walked up to the mission commander and volunteered to go. Alone. At night. Through a surface-to-air missile envelope that intelligence rated as extremely dense. The mission commander had refused. It was suicide. The A-10 wasn't designed for night operations in that kind of threat environment. The smart move, the tactical move, was to wait for daylight and a proper strike package. Voss had looked at him and said 5 words. "They don't have until daylight." What happened next became legend. The official report was sanitized, clinical, full of terminology that obscured the reality of what Voss had done. But the people who monitored her mission from the operations center, who listened to her radio calls and watched her progress on satellite feeds, they told a different story. She'd flown into the night alone, navigating by instruments and memory through terrain that would have been challenging in daylight. The enemy had known she was coming. They'd heard her engines, tracked her approach, and prepared their air defenses. The first missile launched before she even reached the target area. She evaded it through a combination of defensive maneuvering and countermeasures, then kept flying. The second missile came closer, detonating near enough that her aircraft shook from the concussion. Her radio call was steady. "Still here." She'd found the Special Forces team using infrared and their desperate final transmission coordinates. They were pinned in a dry riverbed, surrounded on 3 sides, with enemy forces closing in. Voss made her first pass completely dark, no running lights, no targeting systems that might give away her position until the last second. The enemy didn't know she was there until the cannon fired, and by then it was too late. The gun camera footage showed what happened next. She worked in a spiral pattern, starting from the outer ring of enemy positions and working inward, each burst of cannon fire lasting only seconds but devastating in its precision. She was flying without altitude deconfliction, without forward air controller support, just her judgment and years of experience. One pass, two, three. The enemy fired everything they had at her: missiles, anti-aircraft artillery, small arms. She took hits. Her aircraft's warning systems screamed at her. She ignored them and kept flying. The Special Forces team made it to their extraction point. All 12 men, alive, rescued because one pilot had decided that extremely dangerous wasn't the same as impossible. When Voss finally landed 90 minutes later, her aircraft looked like it had flown through a shredder. Maintenance counted 47 separate impact points: shrapnel, bullet holes, missile fragment damage. The right engine was barely functional. Part of the tail was missing. The crew chief who inspected her bird said it shouldn't have stayed in the air, that physics alone should have brought it down. But it hadn't. Voss had brought it home through skill and will and an absolute refusal to quit while people still needed her. She'd climbed out of the cockpit, filled out the post-flight paperwork with hands that finally allowed themselves to shake, and collapsed in the medical tent from exhaustion and adrenaline crash. They'd grounded her for 72 hours mandatory rest. She'd spent the entire time visiting the Special Forces team in the hospital, making sure they were okay, apologizing that she hadn't gotten there faster. The story spread through the military network like wildfire. Not the official version, but the real one. Pilots who'd never met Voss talked about her in reverent tones. Ground forces who'd heard what she'd done started requesting her by name when they needed close air support. The call sign, Reaper, took on new meaning, not death to be feared, but death delivered to those who threatened American forces. She became something more than a pilot. She became a promise. If you're in trouble, if you're surrounded, if hope seems lost, call for Reaper. She'll be there. But the mission took its toll. Rook saw her again 2 weeks later and the change was visible. She looked thinner, more worn, the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. Her eyes had a distant quality, like part of her was still back in that riverbed, still flying through the dark with missiles hunting her. Other pilots had started approaching her differently, with a deference that seemed to make her uncomfortable. She'd always been respected, but now she was something close to mythical, and Rook could see it weighing on her. He found her in the hangar late one evening, standing beside her A-10. The aircraft had been repaired but still bore the scars of that night mission: patched holes, replaced panels that didn't quite match the original paint. She was running her hand along the fuselage, her fingers tracing the outline of a new mission mark that someone had painted there without her permission. A special one, different from the others, commemorating the Special Forces rescue. "They're calling it the Miracle Mission," Rook said, announcing his presence. "People are saying you're the best A-10 pilot in the Air Force." Voss didn't turn around. "I'm just the one who couldn't say no." Her voice was quiet, almost lost in the ambient noise of the hangar. Those men had families, children, someone's husband, someone's father. How do you leave them there? "Most people would have," Rook said gently. "Command was ready to write them off." Command wasn't listening to their last radio transmission. Now she did turn, and Rook saw something raw in her expression. They were saying goodbye, over the radio, telling their families they loved them through a relay they knew probably wouldn't reach home, and everyone was just accepting it, treating it like acceptable losses. She shook her head. "I couldn't accept it." Rook stepped closer. "You saved them." "I got lucky," Voss corrected. "Those missiles could have hit. My engines could have failed. I could have misjudged an altitude in the dark and flown into the ground. It was luck, not skill." "It was both," Rook said firmly. "And a lot of courage. You gave those men their lives back." He paused. "But it's killing you, isn't it, carrying all of this?" Voss was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Every mission, every flight, I see the faces, not the people I save. The ones I might not reach in time, the ones I might fail. It's like carrying ghosts, except the ghosts are people who are still alive, still depending on me to be there when they call. She looked up at her aircraft, her expression unreadable. How do you put that down? How do you stop caring? You don't, Rook said, but maybe you don't have to carry it alone. He thought of his own Marines, the weight of their lives in his hands during every mission. We all carry it. Everyone who leads, everyone who's responsible for others. You're not different, you're just really good at it. Voss smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Being really good at it just means more people depend on you, more calls for help, more nights wondering if this is the mission where you finally run out of luck or skill or both. She took a breath, seemed to gather herself. But you're right, it's the job. It's what I signed up for. They stood in silence for a while, two people who understood the weight of command, the burden of being the person others counted on when everything went wrong. Finally, Voss straightened, some of her usual composure returning. Your platoon doing okay? They're good, Rook said. Thanks to you. They talk about you, you know. When they tell the story of those 47 hours, you're the turning point. The moment it went from impossible to survivable. Tell them I was just doing my job, Voss said. And tell them they did theirs. It takes both sides to make it work. Rook nodded. I'll tell them, but Captain Voss, they're going to remember you anyway. Years from now, when they're out of the Corps and living civilian lives, they'll tell their kids about the A-10 pilot who came through the smoke and saved them. That's your legacy. Voss looked uncomfortable with the word legacy, like it implied something finished, something past tense. I'm not done yet, she said quietly. There are still people out there who might need me. I know, Rook said. That's what makes you Reaper. The war continued, and so did Voss. She flew more missions, accumulated more combat time, and cemented her reputation as the pilot you wanted when things went wrong. But something had shifted. Other pilots started emulating her techniques, studying her approach to close air support. Flight schools used her missions as case studies in precision and courage. The A-10 community, small and close-knit, held her up as the embodiment of everything their airframe represented: tough, dependable, and absolutely dedicated to the people on the ground. She received commendations, medals, official recognition from commanders who finally understood what they had in Captain Alara Voss: the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal with multiple oak leaf clusters. Eventually, a silver star for that night mission that should have killed her. She accepted them with the same quiet discomfort, always deflecting credit to her ground crews, her mission controllers, the people she'd supported. The awards didn't seem to matter to her. Only the next mission mattered. Rook kept track of her through the military network. He heard when she volunteered for a third deployment, even though she'd already done more than her share. He heard about the missions where she stayed on station until she was flying on fumes, coordinating her departure down to the minute to ensure someone else could take over. He heard about the time she flew with a raging fever because a critical mission was planned, and she didn't trust anyone else to execute it properly. Her squadron commander had grounded her afterward, forced her to take a week of medical leave. She'd spent it studying terrain maps and contingency plans. Eventually, inevitably, the war wound down, not with dramatic victory, but with the slow, grinding conclusion that characterizes modern conflicts. Deployment cycles lengthened, combat missions decreased, and suddenly there was time to reflect on what had been sacrificed and who had done the sacrificing. Voss found herself back stateside, assigned to a training command where she taught young pilots the craft she'd perfected through blood and adrenaline. She hated it at first. The classroom felt like a cage. The simulator missions, even realistic ones, lacked the weight of real consequences. But slowly, she found purpose in it. These young pilots would be the ones flying the next war, supporting the next generation of ground forces. If she could teach them even a fraction of what she'd learned, if she could instill in them the absolute commitment to the people they supported, Then maybe some future Marine or soldier would have a better chance because she'd taught their pilot well. Her students didn't know what to make of her initially. She was demanding, exacting, and utterly intolerant of anything less than excellence. She pushed them harder than any instructor they'd encountered, failed them on exercises where other instructors might have shown mercy. But she also stayed late, reviewed their mistakes with them personally, and shared lessons from her own missions with a brutal honesty that most instructors avoided. She didn't just teach them how to fly the A-10. She taught them why it mattered. One student, a young lieutenant fresh from flight school, made a mistake during a training exercise. He'd been too cautious, held back from a simulated gun run because the target was close to the simulated friendly forces. His caution had allowed the simulated enemy to reposition, and in the scenario, friendly casualties had mounted. Voss had called him into her office afterward, and the lieutenant had prepared himself for an epic dressing down. Instead, Voss had pulled up footage from one of her missions. Real footage, classified at one time but now cleared for training use. It showed her making a pass so close to friendly forces that the gun camera picked up individual Marines diving for cover from the blast. Know what the distance was there, she'd asked. 73 meters. Inside the minimum safe distance by a long shot, and every one of those Marines went home alive because I was willing to accept that risk. The lieutenant had stared at the footage, then at Voss. But if you'd missed... If I'd missed, I'd have killed them myself, Voss interrupted. Absolutely. But I didn't miss because I'd practiced that shot 1,000 times, because I knew my aircraft, and because those Marines needed me to be precise, not safe. She'd paused. There's a difference between being reckless and being willing to do what's necessary. Learn that difference. Master it. Because someday someone's life will depend on you understanding which is which. The lieutenant had passed his next exercise, and the one after that. Years later, when he flew his own combat missions, he'd remember that lesson and make the hard calls that saved lives. Stories like that became Voss's new legacy. Not just the missions she'd flown, but the pilots she'd trained. They carried forward her standards, her commitment, her absolute refusal to accept that anyone calling for help was an acceptable loss. The A-10 community began to change, subtly but profoundly, shaped by the example she set and the lessons she taught. She'd become more than a pilot. She'd become the standard by which others measured themselves. But teaching wasn't combat, and part of Voss seemed to know her time in the cockpit was ending. The aircraft she'd flown, the A-10 itself, was aging. The Air Force kept threatening to retire it, to replace it with newer, faster, more technically sophisticated aircraft. Voss fought those proposals with the same intensity she'd brought to combat missions. She testified before committees, wrote position papers, and made the case that the Warthog's unique capabilities couldn't be replaced by multi-role fighters that were optimized for other missions. It's not about the technology, she'd argued in one particularly heated exchange with a procurement officer. It's about the mission. Close air support isn't a secondary role you tack onto an air superiority fighter. It's a specialized mission that requires an aircraft purpose-built for it. The A-10 was designed to save lives on the ground. Everything else is secondary. She'd paused, then added with quiet intensity. And every time you talk about retiring it, you're talking about the Marines and soldiers who won't have that support when they need it most. The procurement officer had looked uncomfortable. Captain Voss, we understand your attachment to the airframe, but we have to consider cost-effectiveness and... I'm not attached to the airframe, Voss had interrupted, her voice sharp. I'm attached to the people it keeps alive. There's a difference. The debate would continue for years, outlasting even Voss's active-duty career. But her voice, and the voices of others like her, ensured the A-10 stayed in service longer than anyone had predicted. The ungainly Warthog kept flying, kept supporting, kept bringing people home. Eventually, after 12 years of service and more combat missions than most pilots flew in a lifetime, Captain Alara Voss retired from active duty. The ceremony was small, quiet, exactly as she'd requested. Her squadron gathered, along with a few Marines and soldiers she'd supported over the years. Captain Rook was there, now a major, his career advanced by years of solid performance. Staff Sergeant Mendoza came, now a gunnery sergeant with his own platoon. Even Corporal Davies showed up, now a sergeant with a combat action ribbon and scars that told their own stories. They stood in the hangar beside an A-10, not her aircraft but one like it, and listened as the squadron commander read her accomplishments into the record. The medals, the missions, the lives saved. The numbers were impressive but somehow inadequate, unable to capture the full weight of what she'd done. When it was her turn to speak, Voss kept it brief. "I got to do the job I loved for people I respected," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet hangar. "I got to fly an aircraft that, despite what anyone says about its aesthetics, is beautiful in the only way that matters. It does exactly what it's supposed to do. And I got to be there for people who needed me." She paused, looked at the gathered crowd. "That's all any of us can ask for, a chance to serve and to do it well." Someone started clapping. Then everyone joined in and the applause echoed off the metal walls. Voss stood there, uncomfortable with the attention as always, but allowing it this once. When it finally died down, Major Rook stepped forward. "Captain Voss," he said formally, "on behalf of the Marines you supported, protected, and saved, I want to present you with something." He held out a wooden display case. Inside was a piece of metal roughly rectangular, about 6 inches long. It took Voss a moment to recognize it, a piece of her aircraft's armor, removed during one of the many repairs, bearing the unmistakable marks of shrapnel impact. Mounted beneath it was a brass plaque engraved with simple words, "Always there. Viper 2-1, grateful forever." Voss took the case, her composure finally cracking. She stared at it for a long moment, and when she looked up, her eyes were bright. "Thank you," she said quietly. "This means more than any medal." "It should," Rook said, "because it comes from the people who understand what you did. Not the mission planners, not the commanders. The people on the ground who heard your engines and knew they'd be okay." The ceremony ended, and people filtered out into the afternoon sun. Voss stood beside the A-10 a while longer, one hand resting on its scarred fuselage. Major Rook waited with her, giving her this moment. "Any regrets?" he asked eventually. Voss considered the question seriously. "I wish I'd been faster sometimes, gotten to places sooner, saved more people." She paused. "But no, not really. This was what I was supposed to do." "What's next for Reaper?" She smiled at the old call sign. "Consulting work, helping design training programs, maybe some advocacy for veteran causes." She looked up at the aircraft. "Nothing as exciting as this, but that's okay. I had my time." They walked out together, leaving the hangar and the aircraft behind. But the legacy remained, carved in mission marks and memories, in the pilots she'd trained and the people she'd saved. The name Reaper would be spoken with respect in ready rooms and forward operating bases for years to come. And somewhere, always, there would be an A-10 pilot who heard the call for help and remembered Captain Alara Voss, who'd made a promise to always be there and kept it, no matter the cost. The sky was empty now where she'd once flown, but the echoes of her cannon fire, that terrible, beautiful sound of salvation, would never quite fade. Marines were surrounded, and her A-10 came screaming through the smoke, and because it did, they lived.